Good afternoon and welcome to our Tuesdays for Teachers session today, May 24th, 2022. Today's session is a continuation of information we have learned from our content experts. The session today is Reasoning Through Language Arts, our session number 3, a continuum of our GED knowledge and skills gaps presentations. We do want to welcome you. We have on the call today, I am Debbie Fawcett with GED Testing Service. And on the far side, you see my colleague, Susan Pittman, who is our education consultant with many of our professional development projects. And we're very excited today that we have Cheryl Clark-Trim, Amy Hathorn, and Brooke Palmer to discuss these specifics in our third session on reasoning through language arts. And with that said, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Brooke Palmer, to continue the presentation. Brooke?
Thank you, Debbie, and good morning. Thank you for, well, I guess it's afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And as Debbie said, today's focus is on writing session 3. So today is the third of 3 RLA sessions. The prior 2, which are available on the GED website for review, covered information relating to the language portion of the RLA test and the reading portion. And there was a little bit of attention on the writing. But during today's session, we are going to dive much more deeply into the writing portion of the RLA test, otherwise known as the extended response, or ER for short. So by the end of our presentation today, we hope to better equip you to guide your students when they ask, what skills do I need to better develop to pass the GED RLA writing test? What do I need to study? We know that the writing causes a lot of anxiety for both test takers and instructors who are trying to help prepare test takers. And the goal of this session is really to transform some of that anxiety into a preparation strategy that you can use with your students. And so today's focus, as you can see here, will be on targets and indicators, the actual writing prompts. We'll dive into the scoring and rubrics. And then we'll have a larger focus on several helpful online resources and how you can use those to work with students. And then Susan will discuss several strategies to help close the gaps. And then, of course, we'll save time at the end for a Q&A. So on this slide, we have a link to the assessment guide for educators. And I really want to emphasize, we say this in all sessions, but this is a very valuable guide. All GED instructors and staff should really spend time with this guide. The RLA portion begins on page 73, and a list of the targets and indicators and more information about that begins on page 78. And the assessment really emphasizes critical thinking, argumentation, authentic tasks, and real-world skills. And then there's also a link here at the bottom for the free practice test online, which is quite helpful. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in, and we will start by discussing the writing prompts themselves. So for the GED RLA writing prompts, students are asked to read 2 short passages and then respond to a prompt. And the prompt directs students to write an essay, essentially evaluating which passage makes a stronger argument and is better supported. The prompt is almost always the same, or it's essentially always the same, but there might be some very slight wording differences as needed based off the type of passages. And so this makes it actually very helpful for students in preparing and practicing to address the prompt. So next, let's go ahead and look at an example of the prompt itself. So you'll see here on the left side of the screen that the prompt appears on a page 1 tab that's at the top left of the screen. And then the passages themselves appear on the page 2 tab at the top left of the screen. And then on the right side, where right now you see all of my text, this is essentially the white space where students will write their written response. There is no right or wrong answer to the question itself of which writer presents the stronger case. The students are scored on how they answer that question and address the prompt. And I want to point this out. It's pretty important. When I first began with the GED program, I'm fairly new. It's been less than a year. And I was myself becoming familiar with the process and the various components of the RLA. And I started reading the ER materials. And when I reviewed an example of a top score response, I was actually slightly surprised that the student had picked one passage that they thought was the better passage. And it was not the one I would have picked. And that's when I went and started to ask my colleagues and learned that, yes, it's not really which passage you're picking that gets you the points. It's how the students are building their argument, how they're supporting it and using the evidence to say. And really both passages in the ER prompt are going to be pretty good, pretty well supported pieces. So there's not going to be a glaringly obvious passage there that's stronger. So that will really allow students to make that choice for themselves. Students are scored using 3 traits to determine the strength of their written expression. And let's look at those traits now. So the 3 traits are trait 1, creation of arguments and use of evidence. Trait 2, development of ideas and organizational structure. And trait 3, clarity and command of standard English conventions. So on this next slide, we have the prompt again. And what I want to do is talk you through the ways that the prompt itself is really giving students an outline for success across all 3 traits. So let's look at how this prompt relates to the traits themselves. When you see here where it says, it tells students under the plan section to analyze the 2 texts, that relates pretty strongly to trait 1, which again is the creation of arguments and the use of evidence. In order to create the argument to address the prompt, students must first spend time analyzing the arguments that the authors of the passages are presenting. And then it also tells students to include evidence, which is right there in trait 1 where it says the use of evidence. But also you'll see in the prompt that it doesn't just say include evidence, it says include relevant and specific evidence from both sources. And that really jumps from trait 1 into trait 2, which is the development of ideas and organizational structure. Because if students are just picking random pieces of evidence, that's not going to work to support their arguments. They really need to develop their ideas using the appropriate piece of evidence that really supports their ideas and their arguments. And then of course it says to develop your argument, and that word develop is right there in trait 2, which is the development of ideas and organizational structure. And then below that, it says your response should be approximately 4 to 7 paragraphs of 3 to 7 sentences each. Now, I want to point out that this is just a guide, and it is not a formula that students have to stick with. Most of us know that our confident writers or strong writers are really going to understand that, and they'll be able to develop their own arguments using different strategies and different lengths and different numbers of paragraphs. But this is really to help students to know that if you just write a couple sentences or put all your information in one long paragraph and you're not really developing those transitions, then they're not going to be able to get as many points. And so this is a guide to make sure that you're putting enough meat into your argument. And that again relates to the development portion of trait 2. And then finally, remember to review and edit your response. That really ties into all 3 traits, because if students just put their writing down and then don't spend some time at the end to look back through it and make adjustments, then they may have some of those language convention errors or typos. They may miss that there are, pieces of evidence that they need to hone in on or other strategies to improve their writing. Okay, next. So now let's jump into a discussion of why students struggle specifically with the writing. So I do want to mention that overall, the extended response items are not underperforming. And what we mean by that is that data is actually showing a strong correlation between test taker performance on the RLA assessment as a whole and performance on the ER. So that means that students who are getting 0s and 1s on the ER are likely struggling with all skills across the RLA assessment. And the other end of that is that students that are performing well on the RLA assessment as a whole are likely getting higher score points on the ER. And it helps to understand how the skills align across all portions of the RLA. So the reading items correlate specifically to traits 1 and 2 of the ER. And then the language or editing items correlate specifically to trait 3, which is the English conventions. And so really the ER items require a strong written performance across all 3 of the traits. So even though there is a strong correlation between test taker performance on the ER and the test as a whole, we are able to recognize that there are some common reasons for low score responses on the ER. And one of them is that students are not building an argument. This is actually a big problem we see, is that students sometimes are just summarizing the texts instead of evaluating the arguments made in the texts. Sometimes students even go so far as to merely copy words from the text and have absolutely nothing original. And that leads to a non-scorable response or 0 points. But sometimes students might have a very uneven development where they're really only analyzing or discussing one of the texts rather than both. But summarizing, simply just repeating, even if it's in their own words, what the passages are about is not making an argument. Another problem we see is that sometimes students are providing their own opinion about the topic in the passages rather than evaluating the arguments made in the texts. And this happens sometimes where students discuss their agreement with the topics or what arguments are being made in those passages, or their disagreement with an author's position, rather than discussing the strength or weakness of that author's position. Another common reason for low scores is that sometimes students do not write a full response. So they might get in there and start making an argument, but they might not be doing enough analysis. Or they, put an idea down, but they're not elaborating on that. They're not really building their argument, or they're not even referencing the evidence in the text. Again, they might just be sticking with their own personal opinion, and the prompt clearly directs students to use evidence from the text to support their argument. Sometimes students are building an argument and putting ideas and evidence on the electronic page, but they're lacking a structure or an appropriate tone. So sometimes the writing has no clear organization. It has no introduction, body, or conclusion, or there's absolutely no transitions made between ideas. They're just kind of throwing their ideas out there and not tying them together. Or they might not be writing for an audience. And other times I've said this, that they might not be writing for an audience. People have asked me, well, what do I mean by that? And what I mean is that they're just kind of writing as though they're bouncing ideas off of a friend, or maybe even informally responding to the prompt, almost like it's a fill in the blank question and they're just putting the answer. But the written response is really a performance of the RLA skills. And in this way, there is an audience for which the skills are being performed, and that's the reader. And so students really should be writing, and that's sort of the purpose of writing in general, is unless you're journaling, you are writing for an audience. And students should really think about that when they're, performing these skills in the written response. Also, another problem are the actual English conventions are poor. And this might mean that their writing lacks proper grammar, such as subject-verb agreement, or they might really struggle with capitalization and punctuation, use of commas, use of apostrophes. Maybe their writing lacks complete sentences and they're just using a lot of run-on or fused sentences, or sometimes they're even using improper vocabulary. And sometimes that can kind of overlap with the problem of appropriate tone. They might be using incorrect word choice or using too much slang, and again, sounding as if they're just having a conversation with friends instead of using a more formal tone that you would expect to see in a piece of writing for an audience. So let's talk about the ER scoring process and look at the rubrics themselves. So below is an outline of the scoring process, the next couple slides, from field test to assessment scoring. So every ER item is first field tested, and then every field tested ER item is scored by human scorers that are using a detailed rubric for each of the 3 traits. Each of these ER responses is scored by at least 6 human scores, and that's because you have 2 different scores for each of the 3 traits. And then of the 2 scores, if they disagree by 1 score point for the trait, the higher score is always assigned. So in this way, the scoring process really works in favor of the test taker. And this would be like if one human scorer gave it a 0 and the other one gave it a 1, that trait would be scored the 1 point. If 2 scores disagree by non-adjacent scores, meaning one of them gives it a 0 and the other gives it a 2, then the scoring lead comes in to score the trait. And so throughout this process, this means that it's possible for up to 9 scorers to be involved in determining the final score for a single ER item. So after the human scoring is complete for field test items, experts in the field review the data of the items and determine which of these are fair for use on the actual GED assessment. And once those fair ER items are selected and used on the assessment, then the items are scored by an automated scoring engine. So the automated scoring engine was launched in 2014. Why? Essentially to allow a speedy score response to be provided for test takers. Because of the automated scoring engine, test takers are able to receive their scores within 3 hours. This also enables the ER performance to be included in the standard score report, which just wasn't feasible before. Next. So let's talk about the validity of the scoring machine. I know that this question comes up a lot and there can be some, nervousness about this, but rest assured, several hundred scored field test responses are first used to train the automated engine, and then several more hundred are used to test the engine's validity. And when the engine was first launched, responses were scored by both the engine and human scores. And this was to ensure that the 2 systems were in the same ballpark and in agreement. And again, just like with the human scoring, if there's ever a disagreement by a point, the higher point is always the one that's awarded when they're adjacent. So approximately 95% of ER responses on GED are successfully scored using the engine. The other approximate 5% are for those responses that are so atypical that the engine just can't figure out the score. And when that happens, the human scores are used to determine that. So to summarize the whole process again, from field test all the way to a student receiving their score report, it's a combination of human and machine scoring that really enables GED to provide valid results in remarkable time. So now let's go ahead and jump into the rubric itself. And I'm going to point out here that the next several slides, they might look a little bit busy. There's going to be a lot of text on here, some underlining, some highlighting. I'm not expecting you to be able to see everything or process all this information right here and now. I'm essentially highlighting some key points that you can then go back and use these materials on your own and do some of the same analysis. Also, you can, go back through the PowerPoint if that's helpful to you. And it was designed really to do that. And a later portion of the presentation will focus specifically on the resources that these slides are coming directly from. So that way you can access them later. So here is a rubric for trait 1, which is again the creation of arguments and use of evidence. And what I've done is I've highlighted, you can see that there are 3 bullet points for this trait, which are 3 dimensions of the trait. And then there are examples of this for each possible score point, from a 0 to a 1 to the top score response of a 2. And then I've highlighted the main pieces of each of these dimensions and use the arrows to show you that if you basically stair step from the top down to a 0 or vice versa, you can really see how these relate to each other. So for instance, a top score response, or a 2 for trait 1, that first dimension is generating text-based arguments that establish a purpose that is connected to the prompt. So if you go down to a 1 with that arrow there, a student that is following this dimension, but only at a 1-point level, they have an argument that is somewhat connected to the prompt. And then if you look at a 0, their argument lacks purpose or lacks any connection to the prompt. So you can see that clear stair step across the score points. So if we look at the next dimension, the student at a 2-point level cites relevant and specific evidence from the source texts. At a 1-point level, they might be citing some evidence from the source. And at a 0, they have minimal or no evidence at all from the source. And again, I'm not reading or highlighting every single piece of this. So when you go back on your own, it's important to really look at all of this, including the parenthetical examples that are really helpful. And then the third dimension here, I'm sorry if you could go back, Debbie. The third dimension, or bullet under a 2, is analyzing the issue and or evaluating the validity of the argumentation. But if they're only up to a 1 point, they're really just partially analyzing or evaluating the validity of the argument. And finally, at a 0 point, they're minimally analyzing, or maybe they're not analyzing it at all or providing no evidence. So that's essentially how these rubrics work. And when you kind of see the connection of the stair step, it's really pretty clear, and you can analyze students' writing in this same way. I want to point out that this resource, you see these letters A, B, C, and D. This is so on the next slide, when you use this resource on your own, it annotates the rubric and goes even deeper into analyzing how these score points work, or how these traits work. Next. So there's a lot of information here, and we're not going to talk about all of this, but I underlined some of the key points from this annotation here. So under the A, for instance, this note, when a response shows mixed evidence of proficiency skills, it will receive a score that reflects a balanced consideration of each quality. So no one dimension is weighed more than the others, and that's an important piece of information. At higher score points, arguments will be focused on close reading and analysis of the source texts, which again really ties to the prompt. Responses ascending the scale, they will also use evidence that is progressively more tied to the text. And then the point that I've underlined in the D example at the bottom is responses that establish a criteria for the evaluation of source texts and then apply these criteria to specific test-based evidence are most likely to score the highest in this dimension. So this is a student that's really planning, and they're really organizing their thoughts and their argument, and they're kind of setting up before they write their response what it is that they think makes a good argument, and then they're applying that criteria of what makes a good argument to their analysis of the 2 passages. Next. All right, so trait 2 is the development of ideas and organizational structure. And on this one, you can see that there are 5 bullets for each of the score points. I didn't take the time to highlight all of the main aspects of these dimensions. We obviously don't have time today to go through all of these, but just to kind of illustrate how you can do this on your own to really dig into these. Again, I've highlighted an example from the first 2 bullets, and you can mentally use your arrows to work from a 2 to a 1 to a 0. And so for the annotation here, I've highlighted again some of the highlights for the trait 2, developing ideas in organization. High scoring papers will tend to contain multiple ideas that are fully elaborated and that help articulate their central thesis. High scoring responses will also maintain coherence and a sense of progression of their ideas from one to the next. That progression will be well organized and logical. It uses good transitions again, instead of just throwing separate ideas onto the page. Their tone is objective and appropriate for the audience, and they're using norms and conventions of argumentative writing. And then finally, I've underlined that advanced vocabulary, when they're using advanced vocabulary, they're using it correctly. That doesn't mean students always have to use, elevated vocabulary. Really, it's more about using precise vocabulary, precise word choice that's appropriate for their argument. Next. So looking at the rubric for trait 3, which is conventions, standard English conventions and clarity, it's a little bit different because again, we have the 3 dimensions, but the first 2 dimensions or bullets actually give this list of examples. And so again, there's a lot of text on the trait 3 rubric, but it's pretty easy to internalize once you really dig in. So again, I've highlighted the 3 dimensions of the trait 3, and let's just talk briefly through a couple of these. So at its score point 2, the the test taker is demonstrating largely correct sentence structure with general fluency that enhances the clarity of their writing. At a 1 level, they're demonstrating inconsistent sentence structure, which means sometimes they're getting it right. Sometimes they have sentences that are repetitive or choppy or even rambling. At a 0 point, they're consistently flawed in their sentence structure, and so much so that the meaning of what they're trying to say is being obscured. The next dimension is demonstrating competent application of conventions. And so you can look through this list here of all these examples of the use of homonyms, subject-verb agreement, pronoun usage, the use of modifiers, capitalization, punctuation, apostrophes, etc. At the 2-point level, the student may exhibit some errors in mechanics and conventions, but overall, they're really mastering this, and the errors they do make are not interfering with the comprehension. Whereas a student who's getting a 1 point, they have frequent errors in mechanics and conventions, and these errors sometimes interfere with the clarity of their argument. And if they're only getting a 0 for this dimension, then they really have severe and frequent errors that regularly interfere with the ability for the reader to make sense of what they're saying. Next. So again, we've got the annotation for a trait 3, and I've underlined some of the points that stuck out to me as being very important. But again, I invite you to go back and look through all of this, and some of these aspects of this annotation will resonate more with you. I've underlined that high scoring responses mix both simple and compound sentences and purposefully incorporate a variety of clauses to enhance overall fluidity. So I think this is a good point because, some students are trying to have very complicated writing because they think if they just have a lot of super complex sentences, that will strengthen their writing or show mastery, when in fact, an authentic piece of skilled writing doesn't do that all the time. Some points are more simple and need a more simple sentence. So it's really about having the appropriate mixture of simple and compound sentences. Also, responses will be scored on the basis of a student's demonstrated mastery over the particular language skills listed in the dimension. And you can read more about that for that to make a little bit more sense. And I've also underlined that in order to receive a score point higher than a 1, students must sustain their writing long enough to demonstrate proficiency with all the skills listed in the previous 2 dimensions. And that includes grammatical and syntactical fluency. So again, that kind of goes back to why in the prompt we give that guidance for students, because some might think, you know, if they just give a few sentences, if those sentences are well organized and they're telling what their argument is, that that's going to be enough. But we really need a little bit more for students to demonstrate all of the pieces of the trait. All right, next. And I'm going to take a pause and have some water here. Okay, so for the next few slides, we are going to look at an annotated sample response that will show a different score point for each of the 3 traits. And I know we don't have time right here for you to sit and read these on your own and process all the information. So this is more of a guide to show you how this rubric, how these annotated responses work. So you can go back on your own time and do this same kind of analysis. So here we've got, let's see, it is trait 1, which again is creation of arguments and use of evidence. And this response is showing that the student scored a 0 for this trait. And I think it's a good example because I know this came up in the first 2 RLA sessions, a lot of questions about, well, my students were writing a lot. How is it that they, you know, put as much as on the paper as they did, or the electronic screen, and they're still getting a 0? Well, here's an example of that. This one has what looks like 2, you know, fairly well-developed paragraphs and a conclusion there. However, when you really dig in and read this response, and then you look at the annotation on the right, it does have a statement of stance, but the writer here is really only attempting to summarize the arguments from the source text in the response. And the first paragraph is discussing the cons, and the second paragraph is discussing the pros. And so, again, this is an example of students failing to really build an argument. They're just basically giving back to you what they read in the passage, and maybe taking a stance of their opinion again on, you know, on the topic, on where they agree with the topic or disagree, but they're really ignoring that argument building part of the prompt. And while this response draws from the source text for information, the writer does not cite evidence to support any claims. So they're not making any claims. The response is offering a minimal summary of the argument and lacks any analysis. All right, let's look at the next example. So this one is for trait 2, development of ideas and organizational structure. And this is actually a 2-point response. So the student really mastered the trait here. And this one is longer. You'll see that the response actually flows into the next slide. And again, I'm not going to, you know, read this to you, but if you can follow along when you go back on your own, you can see on the right lots of good information about how the writer establishes an adequate organizational structure. They have a beginning and a middle of it and an end. Within this structure, you can see how their ideas are progressing from one to the next. In paragraph 2, they're giving a thorough breakdown of the arguments and the evidence to support that argument. And then you can see some of the highlighted examples toward the bottom of the screen. The other factor of safety concerns, unfortunately, the opponents of, they really are doing a good job of using that transitional language to move from one idea to the next and tie it all back together to the argument in the prompt. Next. And then again, you can see here that it looks like they have about that 7-paragraph development. And again, on the right here, the annotation points out that the writer's tone demonstrates awareness of an audience and a purpose, and the diction adequately expresses ideas. So when you go back and read through these, you can compare across multiple score points where students are really hitting the mark and where they're falling short in the different dimensions of the rubric. Next. And then the last example I have here is for trait 3. And this one's in the middle between a 0 and a 2, so they got a 1. And trait 3 again is clarity and command of standard English conventions. This one you're really looking at the conventions and not necessarily as much at the argumentation or the organization. And you'll see that this one highlights several examples throughout where at times that they're really struggling with different parts of the standard English usage. And other times you can see that they are, doing it well and they've got appropriate use of conventions. And that's why this is really a 1. And so examples here in the rubric say, some of the sentences are awkward, lacking fluency. There's an inconsistent control of standard conventions. And that these errors rarely interfere with comprehension. And overall, this response is at an acceptable level. And so that's why, they're doing good enough to get that 1 point. Next. And so this is just the second page of that. All right, so I'm going to stop again before we move into the last part of my presentation where we dive more into the resources to see if anyone, Debbie or Amy or Cheryl or Marty, has any questions from the chat that they'd like to discuss at this point.
I will say that there are some resources. If you came in a little bit late, if you scroll up, there are some resources, links to resources where the presentation will be posted, the assessment guide for educator, the free practice tests. And I just posted the link to our ER scoring tool. There are a couple questions I'm still not quite sure what's being asked. I think, and someone is also asking about the GED Ready, using the scoring engine on that, and it's not set up the same way as the GED test, so that's not an option at this time. But what I did do is I posted the link to our ER scoring tool that could be a helpful reference in walking through how to score your students' tests.
And Cheryl,
And
this is Debbie. If I could go back, I'm not looking at the chat, but is it someone that just wants to know if the GED Ready is scored by the automated scoring engine, or are they wondering the differences or how they can qualify the score? Okay.
GED Ready is not scored by the scoring engine. That is scored by the adult educators. And then Marty is saying that he thinks, Jean, that perhaps you're talking about a situation in the corrections. Sometimes there is a delay coming from the corrections in the data getting uploaded. So there could be a delay in getting the ER response and the overall score back for those folks. Let me know in chat if you would, if that was your question. And I think that brings us up to date. There was one question, let me go back just a second, Brooke, where someone asked to elaborate. I think it was based on something that you said. One factor that can lower the score is not writing for an audience. Please elaborate. That came from Mary.
Okay. Yeah, and as I was talking through that, I was thinking about how that can be kind of ambiguous and a little bit subjective in a way, and how do you make that objective? And I guess I'm thinking about this, an example where a student is answering the question, but they're not thinking about the fact that they're writing a response. They're basically just answering the question and they're doing it through the tool of writing. But in order to have a written response is intended to be read. So that's the purpose of this, is for students to show that they can use the skills that are aligned across the entire RLA assessment, but doing so in the writing, where you're not just giving an answer by writing, you're actually developing it, presenting it, organizing it in such a way that whoever is reading that's your audience. You don't have to necessarily assume it's a particular audience, and you're not writing for the scores or, But you have to keep in mind as a writer that this is an audience, and who would your audience be for this type of prompt? It's typically something a little bit more formal, a little bit more objective, since, you know, a little academic. It's not something that you would just sit and talk about with your friends and using a lot of slang or shorthand. It's really a way to demonstrate that that you can present yourself in writing in a way that comes across to whomever the audience is and is well received. And hopefully that answers that a little bit. And I think once you jump into some of the resources that we'll be talking about in these next several slides, you'll find some better examples of that also than what I just said.
Brooke, this is Susan. If I could just address a couple things that have come up, and I'm just going to look at it because, of course, I mean, I'll be the first one to admit to everybody that I am not the expert on developing prompts and doing all those things from the GED test, but I'm looking at it from a perspective just as a teacher. And one of the things that I would encourage everyone who's out there is that to think in terms of what skills the student will learn from doing the extended response, because this is not just about, and I don't think of adult education, excuse me, as just being, oh, we get the GED, we do the test, and we're gone. But I really look at that extended response where we're actually helping students learn how to do the type of writing that they will eventually do in the workplace. They will do it within their families. There's so many different things because we look at this and it's really evidence-based writing. And, you know, most of us at some point have to convince somebody of the rightness of the argument that we're making, and that's what the students are really doing. So I know that it can be a challenge for some of our students that are out there, but I really think the payoff in the long run with the growing emphasis that's out there from WIOA, looking from a federal level with the funding, to looking at how we're helping support students to move into the workforce, that's a really positive thing to do. The other thing is that I think all of us as teachers, we look at that rubric and, you know, we want our students to score at the top of the level, and that's not going to be the case for everyone. So even though we have these wonderful examples of twos and that type of thing, I would like for my students and the students I've worked with in the past to be solid ones, that they have that confidence and that ability to do that basic writing that's out there. So kind of keep that in mind, that yes, if you have a student who has told you, they've said to you that, hey, I'm going on to college, I'm going on to a vocational training program, then you want to make sure you really help them with this extended response from that standpoint and try to go for the highest score possible. But also keep in mind that just as people in everyday lives, we need that ability to write as well.
Thank you, Susan. I think that was really helpful. And, you know, like you said, there's any number of audiences that a student eventually later in their life could be addressing in their writing. All right, so I'm going to go over my last slides here, which are just some examples of some of these resources. Some of them are what I used for the previous slides, and how you can use these to build around this lesson in your classroom to help your students with the ERs. So here we've got a link to the What Students Need to Know GED RLA Extended Response Workbook. And below that, a link to answer guidelines. And the workbook is really good at providing visual guides that demonstrate the skills that struggling writers need to improve in order to be successful. And on the next slide, you'll see an example of one of those from that workbook. So here is the kind of visual guide you will find in the workbook. And it really shows, you know, kind of like the prompt. You've got the part where you're planning, you're organizing, you're drafting and writing, and then finally you're editing or revising. And these bullets really compare how a struggling writer might be falling short in this dimension, but a successful writer is mastering that. And then here we've got answer guidelines, and I'm not going to read all of this to you, but it's basically, again, looking at the prompt and going through the different elements of that and giving guidelines for students and the GED instructors on how to really address this. I think number 4 is really helpful when you write your essay. It's got this list of things to do. Make sure that you start by determining which position is better supported, since that's really the question being asked in the prompt. And then, of course, you have to explain why you chose one position over the other. And that's where you develop your argument. And then you have to use evidence. Also, it points out that the better supported position is not necessarily the position you personally agree with. And I think that's a really good note here, because that's, again, where students might, or test takers might go wrong with this, is they get distracted and focus on what their opinion is. And they're really, you know, ignoring the part where they're analyzing the arguments and the evidence and so on. So there's a lot of good stuff here in the answer guidelines that you can use. So next, I want to talk a little bit about this 8 video series. And these videos are range at about 3 to 5 minutes long. And this is an 8 video series that discusses both the logistical aspects of the ER portion of the assessment, and also it gives really helpful tips for success. And in videos 4 and 5, they really focus, they do a good job focusing on the skills from traits 1 and 2. And information in video 5 also guides students with tips on both analyzing and producing strong arguments. And I want to dwell on this for just a moment, because again, I think it really shows the alignment between the ER portion of the assessment and the rest of the RLA assessment, whether it's the multiple choice or the editing items or the technology enhanced, where students are really grappling with arguments and claims and evidence and development of ideas, and whether they're doing it in their writing or recognizing it in others. You can kind of use the passages in the ER as a guide. You know, if you're pointing out where a particular passage has a stronger argument and is really analyzing and giving a lot of support, you can kind of model your own writing off of that and do that same thing. So video 7 encapsulates all 3 traits, but it emphasizes trait 3. And video 8 also covers all 3 traits and focuses more on how the ER is scored. So when I went through this, I decided that I think it's helpful to watch all the videos together. There is some minor overlap, but instead of being redundant, it comes across to me as emphasizing key tips for success, utilizing all 3 traits. And on this slide, this is just a screenshot. So when you use that link, you'll see how it looks, and you've got the 8 videos, and then you just click the little play button and you can watch them in order with your students in the classroom. Some other resources are sample texts from GED Ready practice test and sample prompts. And after in the classroom, you might review the ER workbook together with your students, look at that answer guide and talk through it, watch the 8 video series and talk about the tips in there. You can then use these sample prompts in the classroom so students can begin practicing their writing for the ER. And you can also, as a GED instructor, use these resources to help guide you in scoring your students' writing. So some further resources for instructor scoring time. And you've got your annotated responses for each score point, which I used, some of the slides came from that. You've got a sample prompt, and this one has a scoring guide and a rubric for each trait. And I want to say that the sample prompt linked to above uses the same paired passages as in the workbook, but it includes 9 actual responses across all 3 points. So again, I find some of this overlap to be helpful rather than redundant, because you can get really familiar with those particular passages and then use all of the resources across them to really hone this. And then you've got here the example of a perfect score. And again, this is just one example. So if you look through the annotated responses, you'll see other examples of a 2-point response. Next. And then finally, we have a link here to an older Tuesday for Teachers presentation that was all about taking the angst out of scoring the RLA extended response. And this is a good one to go back and re-review if you were there at the time. It gives you a demonstration by Susan and Debbie of how to use the online extended response scoring tool. And it also gives you really helpful tips for analyzing and developing strong arguments in the writing. And then here we have the link to the extended response scoring tool. And this is for educators to use to score student practice responses. I'm not going to talk about the tool so much here because it's so well covered in this Teachers for Tuesdays by experts that have used it more than I have. So please go back and look at that. And then finally, I just pointed out here at the bottom of the slide that all of the resources on slides 32 through 39 really should be used in conjunction for instruction, writing practice, and providing students with an informed rubric guided ER score. And I think that takes me to the conclusion of my portion of the presentation, and I will hand it over now to Susan.
Thank you, Brooke. And I just want to ask you one question, if I could, before you mute yourself. You made a comment a minute ago about that there was an example out there of a extended response with a perfect score. Let me ask you, is that response perfect, or does it still have a few problems in it?
Well, that's a really good question. It's being called a perfect score response because the score itself is perfect, meaning it's the top level score. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every element or aspect of the response is perfect. And I think when you go back through the rubric again, like we did a few slides ago, you can see even in those, 2-point score examples, there are places, I'm thinking of trait 3, where it says like there might be some errors here and there in the conventions, but overall they've mastered it and they're not, the errors that do exist aren't impeding their argument. So I think that's a really good distinction to make, that a perfect score doesn't necessarily mean 100% perfection across every single, T and I of that response. And also that's the one that I looked at and I thought, that's interesting, because I would have picked the other passage as the one that I thought was better argumented. I think I just made that word up. Sorry, bad modeling. But once you really look at and tie it to the rubric, you can see how that student really follows through all 3 traits of giving their argument, citing the evidence, developing and organizing it, and then using proper conventions.
Thank you, Brooke. I appreciate that, because I really wanted people to understand that, when all is said and done with the extended response, this is still a draft. This is not that polished, perfect piece that all of us aim for when we're having to write something for a school board or the college board or whatever, where we always think, okay, I've proofed it, I've gone through, I've revised, I've edited, I've done all these different things. And then it gets printed, and what you do, you find your error on it just as soon as you do that. But this is draft writing when students are in the testing situation. So let's look just a minute at just a couple of strategies. Many of you who have been here with us, you are aware of these types of things. If you're new with us, they may be some things that might pique your interest as we're going through. So Debbie, if you could move to the next slide, please. A couple of things to keep in mind is that when we're looking at evidence, when it comes to extended response, there are a lot of different types of evidence that students may find when they're reading through the pro and con side. And we all know that some types of evidence is stronger than others, but we want students to be aware of what those different types of pieces are, whether it's facts or it's statistics. In some of the responses, in some of the sources, they may see examples or anecdotes. And when you are sitting in a college classroom, your professor is going to say, you must only use hard data in order to support your argument, or they may give you some very specific things they want to see. But keep in mind that with the extended response here, there's a little bit more leeway within that. So yes, and it's easier sometimes for students to argue that the statistics or the data was much more effective in one piece than another. But just make sure students have an understanding of the different types of evidence that they may see. Next. And as always, Debbie and I wouldn't be on a Tuesdays for Teachers that deal with writing at all if we didn't talk about both sides now. And this comes back to not just the writing portion of this, but this comes back to that essential piece up front where students have to analyze and evaluate what they read. In our last Tuesdays for Teachers session, we talked about how important reading is throughout, and especially these higher order skills. But this graphic organizer is one that I know many teachers have used it across the country. I find it's really easy to use. And if I were a student taking the test, I could easily just draw out a T-chart, have the pros on one side, the cons on the other, and I'm just listing the evidence that I find. If a student is to truly understand both of those arguments, then they've got to go in and analyze it and see what evidence is there. And that can lead them then to develop their claim. Next, please. And this is just an example. This actually comes from the taxation and revenue sources. And we've given you some examples of just the types of evidence that were there. So as a student, it would be very easy for me to then just go in and decide, okay, I picked the opposes side and I want to use these three pieces of evidence within that because I can explain how they're connected to the claim that's being made. The nice thing is that students can see all of this. And yes, there is they can use a highlighter on screen as they're going through working on the extended response, which, thank you, brings up another thing. That's a tool that students need to be aware that that highlighter is there for them as they're reading through. So it would be very easy for them as they're reading to highlight the evidence, and then they could jot down some notes to the side to help them as they're organizing their writing itself. Next, please. The other thing students have to do is if you're going to make an argument, you got to decide which side are you on? And then from there, explain why. I think that's one of the things that I've seen in some student writing samples that I've looked at from teachers who, they're using some of the sample practice items that are out there on the GED website, and they have students write. And you'll see students who will make a claim and they'll say, well, this side is better. But they don't say anything else.
Bless you.
I'm not sure if we lost Susan or she decided she wouldn't say anything else either. This is Debbie. I'll pick up for her right here. and we'll go through there. But these are the primary things that we see when we are helping and moving things along with our students. So Susan, if at any point you kick in, just speak up. But in deciding which side is better supported, these are the big things that they're having trouble with, making that decision and then explaining their reasons. And as Brooke already talked about, it's a matter of, don't just summarize it, but the terms analysis and evaluation are so important for them to understand that that's just carrying it to the next level.
Okay, I will come back in here after I got through coughing. Thank you, Debbie. I appreciate that. You're
Sure.
always good to kick in there for me. And you knew what was happening.
I knew what was going on. That's
Yes.
right.
So one thing I would kind of highlight within this particular slide is actually under the reasons, the word because. This position is better supported because, so that the student is explaining why that position is stronger than the other. That helps lead them through the entire rest of the response itself. It's like setting a roadmap as they're going through. Next slide, please. And once you have that claim, then the rest of it can flow from there. And so what we want to look at for students is that they have their claim, they include their evidence, and we call it a bridge, but it's really a connection, so that you're not just saying this is because, and then they're trying to go through and just list a bunch of things, but they're connecting those individual pieces. Now, another thing, and this may be the students who can write at a little higher level, but that counterclaim and that rebuttal. If the students have used that both sides now, so they really can look at their evidence, this becomes much easier for a student to do. But we wrap it all up after that with a conclusion that brings everything together. So, you know, those are those like 6 pieces that you're looking at as you move through. Next. But from my belief onto you is that everything is about one step at a time. Writing, and especially writing an extended response, doesn't happen overnight. It's not something a student learns to do in an hour. This is something that takes time, but the payoff is tremendous. Earlier, I saw in the chat where someone talked about how students, you know, many students, if they're not going to college, but they still need to know how to write memos and resumes and those things. All of this can play a part in helping them do that as they're going through. And that next to the last bullet, please make sure that your students, they revise and edit, because that is a part of what we need to do in everyday writing itself, is that we need to go back and do that. And sometimes our students, even though they have the time, they don't take the time.
We're going to move through the remember one step at a time as soon as I can get this clicker to work. So let's just fold up with some general strategies, things that you can remember, just a flow to take care of your students in the classroom. So we want to make sure that the GED indicators and the content topics are shared with your students. They can be useful and they can be used as a teaching and a study guide. Then you've got to review those key foundational concepts and content of what they're looking for and reading through. Most importantly, remind them to read carefully the questions and the excerpts. You know, the old thing about, what are they asking me to do first? What am I being asked to do? So that when they go back and they actually do the reading, they have in their mind where they're going with this. All of the things that Brooke was talking about earlier. So if they can read it carefully, and that means both the questions and the passages. So help them find key definitions and terms. It is so important that they understand close reading, reading for understanding, reading for meaning. And if any of that is going to get better in every one of our content areas, not just our RLA classes, our language arts classes, but we have to encourage students to read more. There's no magic bullet. The better reader they are, the better they're going to do in all 4 of the content areas on this test. But most of all, encourage students to analyze the content that they read on a daily basis. Think about what you're reading in the classroom. All of those important things, the questions. Close reading means, hey, think about what you don't understand and ask those questions about it. Underline the terms you don't know. Go back and get the definitions. All of those strong critical thinking skills are going to help them across the board in all 4 of the content areas. And at this point, I think we are at the question and answer session. And that pertains to my turning it over to Cheryl and Marty and anybody who was monitoring the chat first. Any questions we haven't touched on here that we should touch, Cheryl or Marty?
I am not seeing any, so please add your question if there's one that either we missed and have not addressed yet, or if you have a new one. And remember to scroll all the way up to the top to see those important links that we added in at the beginning, the link to the assessment guide for educators, and links to the free practice tests, links to where this presentation will be posted along with any handouts and a certificate that you can print. Also, within the body of the text, we've also included the link to the ER scoring tool for you. That is helpful to quite a few people. Just kind of.
And more than anything, just sort of a summary along the way. You know, we talk in terms, because I have the pleasure of working with these content experts, and we talk I get to hear them talk in this language, and I frame around of it. Let us make sure that we're really clear with you. You know, when we're talking about especially how students are doing, and Susan asked a very good question of Brooke, that when we said we had a perfect, response, well, it didn't mean that everything was perfect, but they hit enough of the high points to score a 2. You have to understand that the way this test was designed, and you experts can correct me if I'm wrong, but majority of our students, if they are scoring at a 2-point level, that is the top tier of writing. And if you think about our performance levels on this test, our top tier is college ready plus credit, performing as though you already have those skills. I would, so when Susan was saying, I hope, my goal is to make sure that they're getting some of those 1 points. It's because we know that the overwhelming majority of our test takers score in that high school equivalency level, in performance level 2. And we are happy to see 15 to 20% of our students scoring in the college ready. Those are some of the students who you might see grab a 2 here or there, but to see a 2 across the board, those are your exceptional students who may be scoring in that very upper echelon. So I think that helps us when we set our sights on where we're looking for our students to be. One of the things we always say is, don't get hung up on the points, but understand that everything you are teaching them to do as you prepare them to be good writers are the same skills that they are being assessed on in the other parts of the test. So if they're going to do well in the other parts of the test, you're helping them get there in all the work you do on the writing. So I hope that brings a little balance to you and understanding why you see 0s and 1s in a large number of your students, and maybe not a 2 here or there. Understand the overwhelming majority of our students are in that 145 to 165 score. And we would certainly expect to get their skills to be able to scratch out a couple of 1-pointers along the way. So I hope that kind of levels the playing field a little bit for you in your understanding of students and the writing portion of this test. Any other comments? Or I think if you'd like to take yourself off mute and ask a question, we certainly have time if Susan and Cheryl and Brooke and anyone else on our team has nothing else to add at this point. Okay.
I'm actually just responding to one about, do you have GED material for English language learners beyond Spanish speakers by chance? No, we do not. The GED test is available in English and Spanish. Those are usually the only 2 languages in which one can earn a high school diploma.
Yeah.
There may be some partners who have some additional study material in other languages, but I do not know specifically who they might be. And if anyone does know, there have been a lot of really helpful people putting some links in the chat. Feel free. I think somebody mentioned moderator. I'm not sure.
Cheryl, there is one question that keeps coming, and I see it popping in there quite a bit. And I don't know if this will be the question that you answer or if Marty needs to answer it, but it comes back to there still is a lot of concern about how does the 12 as a top score correlate to the 20% and exactly how many total points are there on the entire test. And so Marty, Cheryl, I think Marty, that may be one that you want to answer in terms of scales, raw scores, and all that good stuff.
Yeah, so I know this is always a confusing area. This is Marty K. For RLA, there are 62 raw score points. Of those raw score points, 12 of those points are related to the extended response. So that's about 20%. It's actually like 18% or something. So for all of the tests, we report those scores on the same scale, and it's not 200 points. It's a scale of 100 to 200. So think about it. If you turned in a blank paper, you would get a score of 100. So if you're taking the computer-based test and you don't respond to anything, you get a score of 100. If you get everything totally right, you get a score of 200. So it's 100 score points. We report all of the content area tests on the same scale because each of the tests has a different number of score points, of raw score points. So, math is a certain length, social studies is a different length, science is a different length, and RLA is a different length. Rather than reporting all different sorts of raw score points and they'd be all different, it's really hard for people then to understand, what's a passing score. It's not standard. So we standardize all of those raw score points by transforming them to the same scale, 100 to 200. And so it's important to remember it's not like some number of points out of 200. There's not 200 points on the scale. It's only 100.
Thank you, Marty. I appreciate that. And I want to take just a moment of kind of personal privilege here, if I could. We have someone with us today who has been working with adult learners for quite a while, and she has been working in corrections. And her name is Jean Perini. I don't know if all of you have seen her texts, that her chat comments that are coming up, but I have to say thank you, Jean, number one, for all that you do. But her comment today is that she had a guy that they worked with using some of these materials. I know Jean has been with us when we've talked to both sides now. He got his GED, was released the next day. And the kicker of all of this is that he then was able to be at his son's graduation. When all is said and done, folks, that's what all of this is about. And Jean, I just had to say thank you for that. I know you sent that as a direct message to me. You weren't trying to broadcast anything to everybody, but I just think it kind of highlights for us all those things that are out there. Thank you.
Brooke, I see one, and maybe you all addressed it because this is Debbie. And as I said, I was not looking at the chat while I was trying to let people into the room and keep the slides advancing, which is why they didn't always time out perfectly. But there was a question about, is field testing still going on? Because you had talked about it early on in the process. And I don't know if anybody wants to discuss, you know, not in depth on field testing, but the fact that it's something that continues, you know, even after we have gone to the automated scoring engine.
Yes, and I did respond to that.
Oh,
in the
okay, good.
chat, but I'll say it here that we don't have a specific schedule for field testing, but anytime a new question or item is developed, it's always going to be field tested before it goes on to the actual assessment to count towards students' score points. And so the same is true with the ER. So whenever new ERs are developed, they will be field tested, going through that process with the human scores. And then of course, those scores are used to train the machine scoring and so on. And it's really just, it's determined based off the needs of the bank. So that's why it's not a consistent schedule, because there might be, you know, a lot of items in the bank that are ready to be used on the assessment. And then we get to a point where we're running out and we need to develop new items. And that's when they go on a field test.
Thanks, Brooke.
And I also see a hand up for
Yeah.
Janice. I didn't know if she had an opportunity to ask a question.
Thanks, I've just unmuted. Sorry, I'm just fighting some allergies here. I wanted to address very briefly a good technique that we use to encourage our adult students to edit their essays and to actually look at their editing skills. We have them save a version of the edited essay, which we grade, and the unedited essay, which we grade, and we compare them. So it tells us, for instance, is this student who is focusing on punctuation? Is the student who is ignoring synonyms? So it's not the final essay, it's the essay before and after that gives us the real information, because then if we work with them on checking it over, we can target the areas that they really need to address. And it also tells them, you know, check it over isn't just reading it. Yeah, it's my essay, it's all there. There are some demon areas, you know, some devil areas that bother them, and we like to target those. So I'd encourage you to have your students save the unedited and the edited version with the edits showing. So the equivalent, you know, on a Word document, putting in the edits as a shareable document or on a Google Doc, so you can actually see, and they can see where they made the changes. Something that we found to be really helpful. Thanks, everybody. Good luck.
Thank you for sharing that, Janice. I've seen a lot of good tips in the chats going around that are really useful. And I do just want to add before we go that I am seeing a lot of consternation as well about the ER and it being, you know, challenging and causing a lot of issues or nervousness or concern for students. And I just want to invite everyone to, you know, give it a chance. The tips that we have in today's presentation, go through the slides later after it's posted and look at those resources, work them into your classroom if you haven't already, and see if you can start to see an improvement in the students' writing before saying, you know, this is too much and I think the student just shouldn't even try. So try all these various tips from today and see if you can start to recognize some improvement.
Well, I think there are two other overriding things here. Janice, what you just mentioned when you said you look at their edited and their non-edited writing, you know, that was the same purpose. I think we kind of we've explained it in other sessions, but the whole intent in the practice test, there were a couple of reasons that the automated scoring engine isn't used on the extended response in the practice test. And one of them was because it was always intended that this be a teaching tool, because you can get a copy of that student's written response. And the other thing, in many of our other sessions, we've spent a lot of time going over how for teachers to get over their nervousness about using, especially now that it's an electronic scoring tool that will do the addition and the numbers for you. And when you're finished with that electronic scoring tool on the extended response, you also have a guideline for the skills that need to be improved. So it does take a little bit of get yourself used to it, spend a little time, 2 or 3 run-throughs and experiences, and you'd be amazed at how, oh yeah, I get this now. Just as she had marked the dimensions and the traits there, you begin to see, oh, there was so much writing there, but one just builds on the other. There's a progression. And so it makes a lot more sense to you if you'll just invest 30 to 45 minutes to practice a couple of reads on it. So good luck with it. I think you'll see a marked improvement in how you can work with your students. At this point, if there are no other questions, I did roll up to the slide to let you know that our last, in what Susan and I have thoroughly enjoyed with our content experts, our last content area to discuss the skills gaps on will be science on June 28th. And that will conclude really the work we have done for this year in our Tuesdays for Teachers with our content experts. And we will obviously take a break in July and possibly August. And we will reset the tables. I believe we will only be doing every other month once we begin back in August of this year. So that's for those of you that listen to us quite often. And hope to see you on June 28th. If you have any questions, you can always email us. And the easiest way to remember, if you can't remember Debbie Fawcett at GED.com, is help@GED.com, because it will get routed to us answering your questions. So my colleagues, Cheryl, Marty, Brooke, Susan, anything you all would like to add?
How can I get a copy of today's presentation?
We will post this at GED.com within 48 hours. All of our webinars are posted, and you go to the listing of things, you go to the Educator and Administrators Pool tab, and then look on the left-hand side. It says Professional Development. Click on there, it'll take you to the webinars, and the last 8 or 10 are posted there. You'll have the recording, you'll have the PowerPoint, and some of the resources that were listed, and a certificate that you can download if you need to turn that in for participation to people in your area. Okay.
Well, if I want to forward it to someone, can I?
When you download it, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So can this other person access it on their own if I just give them the website?
That is correct. It's public and open. Yes.
Yeah, I like the way that argument was done and the evidence and the sheet and how it was set up. Okay.
Yeah, Susan and I, you can tell what Susan and I prefer. Now, when she has taught this, when I've taught this, there are a bazillion different kind of graphic organizers out there for argumentative writing. And you need to show students an assortment, because something's going to ring their bell in one form that another form doesn't. For me, I like the both sides now. But there are other forms out there that you could certainly expose students to and let them decide which makes the most sense to them as they try to organize their thoughts to do that written response. So thank you.
That's all I have. Thank you. Very good presentation.
All right. Appreciate it. Yeah. Well, guys, we hope to see some of you in the conference in July in Atlanta. And we hope to see you on June 28th. And then let's remind you to get registered for the conference in Atlanta. So we'll be looking forward to it. For my colleagues, Cheryl, Brooke, thank you all so much, Marty and Amy, for the work you've invested on this particular 3 segments, and Susan. And I will say, have a great day and enjoy the last 3 minutes of your day that I'm giving back to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.